What a remarkable few months we've endured in this COVID-19 lockdown. And Lord willing, in the next day or two, it's going to come to an end. We'll move to level 1 and things will go back to normal. It's possible we could even be back in church together next Sunday. And yet the reality is, while we return to normal, it's not really the same normal we were in before, particularly in terms of the economy. Economists are telling us that we will be facing in New Zealand our biggest recession potentially since the Great Depression of the 1920s and 30s. We heard a couple of weeks ago that in the month of April, 37,000 jobs were lost. The Reserve Bank has said that our annual GDP could fall by the greatest amount for 160 years. And the truth of the matter is there are some pretty serious economic consequences ahead of us as a country. And some of you have experienced that already. You may be the owner of a business and you've had to deal with some pretty serious cash flow issues in these last few months. Or perhaps you're a wage earner and you've had to reduce your pay slightly or the number of hours you work to help your business to get through this time. Perhaps you're one of the thousands of people that have been made redundant over these last number of weeks and months, and you're facing the reality of trying to find a new job in this new shrinking economy, perhaps on a benefit for the very first time. And even if you haven't been personally affected by the downturn in those kinds of ways, certainly our economy moving forward is in reset. It's looking at a brand new reality. And maybe our personal economies, our personal finances need to look at a reset as well. We're in the series on reset, and last week Jonathan introduced us to these 7 key markers of spiritual maturity. And last week he took us through spirit transformation. The idea that the Holy Spirit has been given to us to transform and change our lives, to bear his fruit and to change our character. And the need Jonathan talked about of us constantly allowing the Spirit to fill us and change us and transform us. Well, today we're jumping to the very bottom of this list because the order really isn't that key. And we're looking at this concept of joyful generosity. And the key question I want us to think about together is this one. What does it look like to reset our lives in the area of our finances? What would it mean if we pushed the reset button in the way we view and use our money and our possessions? Jesus had a lot to say about money. Scholars estimate that anywhere between 10 and 20% of the recorded teachings of Jesus in the Gospels relates to our money and our possessions. And some of that's about how we use it, but even more of that teaching is about how we think about it, the mentality that we have towards our money. Money and the way we handle it is actually a key part of our walk with Jesus. One author said that as far as God is concerned, our faith and our finances are actually inseparable. And so what kind of reset do we need in this area of our money? Today I want us to look at a passage that Paul wrote in his first letter to his associate Timothy. The very end of this book of the Bible, the New Testament that we call 1 Timothy, there's this interesting paragraph about money. It's at the very end of 1 Timothy 6, and it almost feels like Paul is winding the letter up. In verse 16, it sounds like he's come to an end and he's about to write, "Yours sincerely, Paul," when he just adds one final comment. And it's that final comment, that postscript, the PS on the letter, that I want us to look at together. What Paul says to Timothy about money. Here's how it begins in 1 Timothy 6, verse 17. Command those who are rich in this present world, Paul writes. And we need to pause here because many of you may be at least mentally reaching for the remote control for your TV even as we speak. Because the truth of the matter is the vast majority of us look at these words and decide this doesn't apply to us. We see a word like rich, and for the vast majority of us, we feel like that doesn't fit us. I don't feel rich. Trying to pay off a mortgage, try to make the finances work for our kids. Really, many of us feel like we're just living from week to week, from hand to mouth. We don't go to Santorini for holidays. We don't have some luxury yacht moored somewhere in a harbour. Most of us feel like this isn't actually relevant for us. But we actually need to pause and consider this globally. I've been reading some different ideas and articles on this, and as I've tried to put some different figures together that different scholars had, this is what I've discovered. That if you earn more than 75,000 New Zealand dollars, you are in the top 1% of earners in the world. If you earn more than $40,000, that's your salary or wage in a year, you're in the top 10% of earners worldwide. Now, I checked this week, the average wage in New Zealand is just a touch over 50,000. So what that means is that well over half of Kiwi earners are in the top 10% globally. And many of us are in this elite bracket of being in the top 1%. And so when Paul writes to those who are rich in this world, he's writing to you and me. In fact, let me put it in perspective a little bit more. Look at this last line. Almost half of the population of the world lives on less than $2 a day. That means if you're a teenager watching this message and you do some babysitting for a family up the road once a week and you get, say, $20 for that babysitting, you earn more than half the population of the world. A teenager who babysits regularly once a week is in the rich half of the world. And so, while it may not be appropriate for a few, for the vast majority of us, we are rich. Many of us are in this top 1% category. And so what Paul says to those who are rich in this world, he's writing this to you and me. So what does he say? He says, command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. He gives two key negative commands to those who are rich in this world: to not be arrogant and not to put our hope. And then he contrasts that with some positive comments in the rest of the verse. And there's a structure here that may not be immediately obvious, but I think is incredibly helpful. You see it in these two middle verses. The second negative is to not put their hope in wealth, and that's contrasted in the next line with instead put your hope in God. And there's a similar contrast in the first and last part of this section too. Don't be arrogant, but instead realize that it is God who richly provides us with everything we need. And as we think about a reset around our money, as we think about a new mindset towards how we operate with our finances, what Paul is saying is that this is going to help us in some significant ways. The first way is to help us move from arrogance to thankfulness. That if we reset our finances and adopt this new mindset, it'll help us to move away from a sense of arrogance towards being more and more thankful for what God has given. But what does that mean? See, again, I think for many of us, we'd say, well, I'm not arrogant. Just as we would say, well, I'm not really rich, we'd say, I'm not really arrogant either. It's not like I flaunt my wealth. We live in a pretty basic house. I drive a Toyota, for goodness sake. We don't have a lot to play with. I don't feel like I'm arrogant. But Paul is saying something quite specific here. And my belief is that he's basing this on a really important passage from way back in the Old Testament book of Deuteronomy. Here's what Deuteronomy 8 says. When you have eaten and are satisfied, praise Yahweh your God for the good land that he has given you. Be careful that you do not forget Yahweh your God. Otherwise, when you eat and are satisfied, when you build fine houses and settle down, when your herds and your flocks grow large and your silver and gold increase and all you have is multiplied. When all of this happens, Moses says, then your heart will become proud, arrogant, and you will forget Yahweh your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. The children of Israel are on the cusp of moving into the land that God has promised them. Moses is going to die. He's going to hand the leadership over to Joshua. And he gives these words of warning to the people of Israel. He says, just be careful that when you go into the land and settle into the homes that are already there and take over the vineyards and the crops and bring in your herds and flocks and they begin to multiply. And as you are blessed in this land, and as you get more sheep and goats and camels and more abundant crops, and as you expand those homes or build new ones, here's the danger. You could become arrogant by forgetting this is all from God. And that same danger is the danger that Paul is saying is true for all of us who are rich in this present world. See, it's easy for us to look at what we've managed to accumulate in life and think it's our hard work and our diligence. It's our business acumen and skill. And that is true to a certain extent. In fact, the Bible, especially in the book of Proverbs, extols diligence and hard work, and it condemns laziness. But what Moses was saying in Deuteronomy is what Paul is now reiterating in 1 Timothy, is that while much of what we have been given has been through hard work and diligence and skill, ultimately, everything we have is a gift from God. And we need to be incredibly thankful for what God has given. I love the way that David describes this in a beautiful prayer that he prays towards the end of his life. In 1 Chronicles 29, David prays these words, "Yours, Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the majesty and the splendor. All worship is due to you, God," he prays. Why? "For everything in heaven and earth is yours." Just think about that last line for a minute. Everything in heaven and earth is God's. That means the house I live in, it's actually God's house. The car that I drive, that's God's car. The business that you own, it's actually God's business. The assets that you have, the toys that you play with, the jet ski that you enjoy, the holiday home that you have, the clothes that you wear, that's all God's. See, David is saying everything has come from him. He goes on in this beautiful prayer, "Wealth and honor come from you. You are the ruler of all things." And I think in these words, David is capturing an idea that Moses was trying to portray back in Deuteronomy 8, and that Paul is trying to help us understand in 1 Timothy 6. It's an idea that you find all the way through the Bible, but is a revolutionary idea for us. And I think this is the heart of the reset we need when it comes to our money. This is the mindset change that we need to adopt. This is not my money. This is God's money. See, this is a radical idea. This is not my money. This is God's money. And the more we can recognize what David prayed in that beautiful prayer, the more we recognize what is at the heart of the warning that Moses gave to the children of Israel, the more we see what Paul is saying to Timothy to say to those who are rich in this present world. It's that God has given us everything we have for our enjoyment. Yes, we might have worked hard. Yes, we might have gone and got that degree. Yes, we may have scraped as we established a business. Yes, we might have worked hard to climb through the career that we have. But at the end of the day, all of that is actually a gift from Almighty God to us. See, this is not my money. This is God's money. And the more we can adopt this new concept, the more we can reset our thinking around this key idea, the more, Paul says, we will move from arrogance, forgetting God in the process, to thankfulness, praising God. This is all from Him. It will also help us move in another direction as well, which is what Paul is saying in the other part of this key verse. Not to be arrogant, but to be thankful, but also adopting this idea, this concept that this is not my money, this is God's money, will help us move from putting our hope in wealth to putting our hope in God. It'll help us move from idolatry towards trust. For a long time as a Christian, I really struggled with the idea of idolatry. I've traveled to places like Thailand and Nepal, where you see in many places idols everywhere, which is what it was like in the ancient world. But we don't really have that a lot in the Western world as much. I've never bowed down to a little statue of wood or gold, and so a lot of what the Bible has taught about idolatry, really I didn't quite understand what that was saying to me. And then a number of years ago, I read one of the most profound books for me that have changed my life and my way of understanding the world. It's written by a pastor in New York called Timothy Keller. It's called Counterfeit Gods. And what Tim Keller talks about is that while the ancient world and many cultures still in our modern world do worship physical idols, in the Western world what we tend to do is we worship the concept behind that idol. So in Keller's words, an idol is any good thing that becomes an ultimate thing. And so money, which can be a good thing, can become an idol in our lives. So can power, so can our career, so can love and romance, so can sex. Children can become an idol. Beauty and physique can become an idol. Any good thing, Tim Keller says, can become the ultimate thing in our life. And the way that looks is anything in life that we look to for our meaning and purpose, or anything in life that we look to for our identity and significance, or anything we look to for our security, that becomes an idol. And that's exactly what Paul is warning Timothy about, to warn those who are rich in this present world. See, he says, tell them not to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God. See, the big danger of money is we can think that's where our security lies. And so we need to make sure we've got a really good margin in our budget. We need to make sure that we're saving for a rainy day. We need to make sure that our KiwiSaver is growing so we've got enough to retire with. And all of those things are really good things. Again, the book of Proverbs says we should manage money well and budget and live within our means. So all of that's good. But the problem can be is when we put our hope in our wealth, when we find our sense of security in our bank balance instead of in the God whose money it is anyway. And it's fascinating. I've been incredibly challenged by this concept just in these last few days. See, about a year ago, almost exactly, I crashed with burnout. My counsellor called it multi-layered burnout. It was pretty serious. And so a few months later, I had to resign from my position as the pastor of our church. And so I gave up employment. And now instead of being a pastor that's employed full-time by a church on a regular salary, I am now a self-employed visiting preacher, a pastor, a minister at large. And so I've gone from the security of a paid job in employment to now being self-employed and wondering where that money will come from. Earlier generations used to call this living by faith. And it's been quite a scary journey. What's been incredible for my wife Rochelle and I is how good and faithful God has been to us with our finances over this year. But as I was thinking about this idea, this concept that God wants us to move from idolatry to trust, from viewing our security in our bank balance versus to looking to God for our security, just in these last few days, I've felt the quiet nudging of God's Spirit. Because what I've suddenly realized is how often I'm on my phone, looking at my banking app, checking our savings levels, because we're trying to make sure that we've got a really good buffer of savings because our finances are less certain these days. And that's a really wise way for us to live. But I've been really challenged in these last couple of days preparing this message, how often I pick up my phone and how often I'm looking at our bank balance and how much we've got in our savings. And I've felt the quiet whisper of the Holy Spirit saying to me, Brad, your security is not in your bank balance. Your security is in me. And that's how we've experienced this past year. We've found that God has looked after us and sustained us and given what we've needed. But the challenge I've felt in my own heart is that I'm tending towards idolatry. And I need to remind myself again and again, you know what? This is not my money. This is God's money. And I need to trust Him with it. Because the truth of the matter is, there isn't a lot of security in money anyway, is there? Look at these words from Proverbs 23. Do not wear yourself out to get rich. Have the wisdom to show restraint. Cast but a glance at riches and they're gone, for they will surely sprout wings and fly off to the sky like an eagle. I love this. I love that image of a wad of money suddenly sprouting wings and just flying away. But the truth of the matter is that wealth is uncertain. There are no guarantees. And all it's taken in these last few months is for a tiny microscopic virus to circle the globe. And the world economy is in lockdown, and companies are going bust, and bankruptcies are being filed, and millions around the world are being made redundant. Wealth isn't certain. And so God reminds us, this is not your money. It's mine, that I'm sharing with you. But if we would adopt this mentality, if we would reset our mindset around this idea, it's not my money, it's God's money. It helps us not only move from a sense of arrogance and forgetting God to thankfulness, it helps us to move from this idea of idolatry and trusting in our bank balance to trusting in God Himself. Helps us with one final move as well. Here's what Paul says next in 1 Timothy chapter 6. Command those who are rich to do good, to be rich in good deeds, to be generous and willing to share. Notice, by the way, these last two lines are about being generous with our money, but these first two concepts, they're more about just being generous in other ways, being generous with our very lives and with our time and helping others. And Paul says in this way, they'll lay up for treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life. Paul is basing these words here on the words of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, about not hoarding in this world, about not laying up a bulk of money in this world, but instead laying up for ourselves treasure in heaven by being incredibly generous with what we have. Over the years as a pastor, I've often been asked the question, how much should we give? And the answer to that often revolves around a concept from the Old Testament called a tithe. The word just means 1/10. And so in the Old Testament, the people of Israel were told to set aside 1/10 of everything they had, their income, their produce, their crops, to give to God. And there's been an ongoing debate through the years between pastors and scholars and ordinary Christians. Is that Old Testament concept mandatory for New Testament Christians, or do we have more freedom? Personally, I think we have freedom, but I think the tithe is a helpful concept. However, the more I've thought about this in the last couple of years, the more I've been gripped with this new mindset that actually this is not my money, this is God's money. I've come to see the tithe actually as something that may not be helpful for us. Because here's what we do. What we do is we take our tithe, that 10% of our income, and we put that to one side and we say we're giving that to God, and we set up an automatic payment to GCC, or we sponsor a child through Tier Fund, and we keep a little bit extra to give to some things as the Spirit leads us. And then what we say is, well, that means the 90% is mine. But that cuts right across this concept, this mindset we've been talking about, doesn't it? That this is not my money. It's all God's money, 100%. And pushing 1/10 aside and saying, well, that's God's, actually isn't true, because everything I have is His. And what 1 Timothy 6 is telling us is that we need to balance this idea that all that we have is from God. And He's given it to us for two purposes. Verse 17 says, for our enjoyment. And verses 18 and 19 are telling us so that we can be generous with it. And I think there's meant to be a tension in that as we walk with God through the years of how we figure out how much of this should I use for my enjoyment and for life, including necessities, and how much of this should I be generous with. And this is especially true, I think, as over the years often our income grows. Paul wrote some really key verses in the letter of 2 Corinthians, especially through chapters 8 and 9. But among the lesser known verses in that section of Scripture are these couple of verses here. And God is able to bless you abundantly, so that in all things, at all times, having all that you need, you will abound in every good work. Don't miss what Paul is saying here. Let me go back to this beginning. God's able to bless you abundantly. God is able to, over time to increase what he gives to you. But notice the next two key words. So that. This is the reason God may bless you, so that having all that you need, you may abound in every good work. In other words, what Paul seems to be saying is, what if God over time increases our income so that having what we need, we are able to increase what we are giving in generosity to others. See, he says it again here in verse 11. You will be enriched in every way so that you can be generous on every occasion, which will result in thanksgiving to God. See, what tends to happen over time through our lives is we start off working as babysitters and then a part-time job and then we get our first full-time job, but it's pretty much minimum wage, and then slowly, for many of us through our lifetimes, our income levels go up. But what happens is that so does our expenditure. We just match our expenditure to what our income levels are. But what Paul seems to be saying is, what if God's increasing his giving to us so that we would increase our giving to him and to others? In a brilliant book called The Treasure Principle, Randy Alcorn says these words. What if God prospers me, not to increase my standard of living, but to increase my standard of giving? What if over the course of life, as God poured out his abundance into our lives, sure, we allowed our expenditure to grow, we did enjoy more of some things, but we also saw that as a God-given opportunity to be more and more generous, because it's not my money, it's his money. I found this graphic a couple of years ago from a church in Canada that tried to portray this. Over a lifetime, the income level so often goes up. And what they try to suggest in this graphic is that while in the beginning you may give just a little bit above that line because you need most of that to survive, what if over time we gave an increasing proportion of what God poured into our lives to others? See, this is not a 10% tithe mentality. This is I am going to give more generously as God pours more generously into my life. And what really helps us to live that kind of way is this reset, this new way of thinking, this new mindset about our money. It's not my money, it's God's money. And the more we adopt that, the more it helps us, I think, to move from arrogance to thanksgiving, and idolatry to trust, and from selfishness to generosity. See, when you look at these three moves that Paul is talking about in 1 Timothy, it really brings home, I think, this choice that we have. Will we view our money and finances and income as ours, or will we view it as God's that he's entrusting to our care? See, arrogance and idolatry and selfishness all flow from a view that this is my money, I've earned it, and I can do what I want with it. I'm not answerable to anyone. But the more we move from that mentality to recognizing, no, this is God's money, all of it, and he's entrusting it to me for my enjoyment and my generosity, it moves us towards a thankful heart. and it moves us towards trusting more and more in Him, and it moves us towards a life of generosity that actually echoes and images the kind of God that He is. So as we finish today, what does this mean for you and me this coming week? Well, I think this is more a mindset than anything. I don't want to give a bunch of rules or strong suggestions around this. What I'd love you to do is reset the way you view your money. And I'd love you to take this key idea away with you. This is not my money. This is God's money. But here's something I'd love you to try as we finish up. This week, as you go about your normal week, as you fill the car with petrol, as you walk into the supermarket, whenever you pull out your wallet or your purse, can I just ask you to pause and just say to yourself, this isn't my money. This is God's money. Whenever you reach into here and you pull out your credit card, can I encourage you every time you pull out your credit card this week to just stop and say, God, help me to remember, this is not my money. This is your money. Every time you reach for your phone, as I do, to check your accounts online, can I just remind you to stop? Lord, this is not my money. This is your money. Help me to be more thankful than ever for what you've given me. Help me to not trust in my bank balance, but to look to you, the giver of this money. And help me, Lord, to balance my enjoyment of what you've given with an ever-increasing generosity. Because, Lord, this is not my money. It's yours. God bless.